Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 27 of the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. Before we dive into today's episode, I wanted to share a couple of quick updates. Firstly, my 300-hour online yoga teacher training registrations are now open. While we've opened all modules, I'm just going to talk about module 1 and 2 in today's episode. Module 1 is called Unleashing the Power and Potential of Restorative Yoga, and module 2 is about the purpose and practice of pranayama yoga. You can find details of these at letstalk.yoga if you've been looking to study these online or you just want to practice these for yourself. Then just you can find all the details online, or if you're on my email list, you'll get updates as well. These are going to be live and they're going to be small group trainings. So I'm really excited to finally announce these, and they start in April and they're spread across 2021. My second update is a monthly shout out that I do to the listeners who left us some amazing, thoughtful reviews. So a big thank you to Nick Sen Bachelor, Madeline Bella, Lisa Malinowski Cameron, Holly Watkins, Seagoods, PieGirl4327, Gooseby, and the person who has all emojis in their name. In today's episode, we talk about yoga philosophy. My guest is Dr. Shyam Ranganathan. He's a field-changing researcher, scholar, author, and teacher of philosophy, and an expert in the neglected traditions of Indian moral philosophy, which covers practical questions of how to live, what to aim for, and what we should value, including yoga. Unlike many gurus of yoga and the Indian tradition, Dr. Ranganathan is a trained scholar and researcher of philosophy and is an author, editor, and translator of over 50 peer-reviewed scholarly works. I've been waiting to do an episode on philosophy for a while now, and I knew I didn't want anyone and everyone to talk about yoga philosophy. Dr. Shyam Ranganathan is the perfect person to talk to us about this subject. He has such vast experience and expertise. So I'm really glad and honored that he agreed to be on the podcast today. We talk about what encompasses yoga philosophy, what's the end goal of studying all the yoga philosophy, how do we measure progress, the dangers of interpreting yoga, and what happens when non-experts pretend to be experts on the subject, and when non-philosophers act like philosophers and talk about philosophy. We speak about the importance or the significance of studying with South Asian philosophers, the role of Western imperialism, and we touch upon what is Hinduism and how is that related to yoga. And there's just so much more that Dr. Shyam packs into today's episode. So I really hope you enjoy this interview, and more importantly, you get to learn something from this interview. You can find all links and resources at letstalk.yoga. As always, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Here's my interview with Dr. Shyam Ranganathan. Hi, my name is Arundhati, and you're listening to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. I'm an ex-Bollywood dancer turned yoga and wellness educator. I've built a 6-figure business as an immigrant, woman of color yoga teacher with no business background, no handstands, pure instinct, and the free information found on Google. If you love doing yoga and you dream of teaching it someday, this podcast is for you. We go over everything from doing and teaching yoga to scaling a small business, living a modern yoga lifestyle, and so much more. You'll find interesting, fun, raw conversations along with some tips, tricks, strategies, and insights in this podcast. So grab your cup of chai and let's jump in. Hi, Shyam. Welcome to the show. I'm so excited you're here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we jump into our conversation about yoga philosophy today, I'm really curious to know, was yoga and philosophy always a part of your life, or was there a turning point that brought you here?
Well, I made a decision when I was 17 to study philosophy. And I had a previous life where music was very important to me, but I was getting frustrated with that. And so I just decided philosophy, which was a really good decision on my part, because I felt like I found my people. So in ordinary life, everybody wants you to agree with them, otherwise they're upset at you. But in philosophy, you can disagree, and that's kind of part of what it is to participate. So that was I found that very liberating. Yoga, I was raised in a traditional Sri Vaishnava home. I mean, as traditional as you can get in North America. And ideas of yoga are just, they're so basic to the tradition that you don't even know you're learning about these ideas. They're there. One of the challenges is that they are mediated, whether in India or in North America, by people's historical experiences, and the major event that messes everything up is Western imperialism. So it doesn't really matter if you're in South Asia or in outside in North America. People's The way they talk about the tradition is often through the filter of the European tradition. So even though these ideas of yoga were there in the background, I don't think I really understood them until much later, when I was asked to teach yoga philosophy to students at an Ayurveda school. And I was working on my PhD on translation, and I couldn't stand any of the translations of the Yoga Sutra. I found they were all methodologically confused. So I decided, well, I guess I have to translate it myself. And that was the beginning of my deep study of yoga. I'd already completed an MA in South Asian Studies, and I'd already written on the history of Indian philosophy, but finding the Yoga Sutra at the time when I was thinking about these technical problems of translation, etc., was like a complete miracle. And because it taught me a lot about these technical problems I was trying to solve. And then over time, just, it was funny. Every year I would go back to the Yoga Sutra, either because I was teaching it or understand it. And then every year I would just get more and more deeply involved in the practice, until one day I just woke up and realized I was a practitioner of yoga as taught by Patanjali. So there wasn't a definite moment when I decided, oh, yoga's for me, but there was a definite moment when I realized I was a yogi doing yoga.
Wonderful. I I want to ask you, how has, and this is probably a really big question, but how has Western imperialism affected yoga?
Well, it affects our understanding of anything, including the Western tradition, right? It's so the Western tradition is a peculiar tradition insofar as it's based historically on this model of thought that we could call the linguistic model of thought. So, according to the linguistic model of thought, a thought is the meaning of what you say. It's a very ancient theory in the Western tradition. It's not found at all in South Asia. It's controversial in China. But if you think that thought is the meaning of what you say, then you think that to understand a thought is to understand it in terms of what you would say. And then to understand anything, including other people, is this kind of narcissism, right? You have to understand it in terms of what you would say. And so the West has been engaging in imperialism for millennia, but once it politically takes over South Asia, it changes even how South Asians think about their tradition. So what most people don't realize is that they end up absorbing this theory of thought that, well, if I'm going to understand the history of South Asian philosophy, I have to understand it in terms of what I would say. And so then what happens is no one really studies philosophy. Everybody just talks about what they would say. And it doesn't matter whether you're European or not. This is just the nature of the colonialism. It's a virus that passes along this viral tendency to try and treat understanding as just this question of what you would say and what you would believe. And so when we come to yoga, ironically, yoga, as taught in the Yoga Sutra in the earliest philosophical texts, is critical of this idea that we need to understand things in terms of our experiences and beliefs and what we would say. It's an argument that says that we need to be in charge. We need to understand ourselves as responsible for those things, in which case I can't explain myself in terms of what I'm experiencing or what I would believe, because I have to own my responsibility for choosing to do those things. So the more basic explanation is choice and responsibility. So we don't unless you do the kind of work that I kind of accidentally started doing, where I started to look at the history of the West, its difficulty understanding alien traditions, and then studying the political impact of this, you would just do what everybody does, right? Which is, when it comes time to explain something, you would explain it in terms of what you believe. So it's a pretty pervasive effect. And so that's one of the reasons why I started becoming more public about teaching yoga and philosophy. I felt like someone had to point out that.
I'm glad you actually do what you do. It's pretty dangerous, I think, when anybody who does some amount of yoga, not even yoga, just parts of it, they start to act as experts when in reality they're actually not experts and not even philosophers. And I think a lot, and that's very dangerous. Every second yoga teacher I've come across, they often sell their interpretations of the practice. And I've loosely been talking about it as interpretation versus the definitions given in yoga. But when I was researching, your work for this interview, I came across something that's really powerful on your website where you spoke about interpretation versus explication and the dangers of interpreting something pretty much based on our experiences, our biases, our and this is so overlooked, Sham, in the yoga world. And so I was just wondering if you can talk, I know you said a little bit, but a little more about the dangers of interpreting something and what we can do instead.
Great. So to really understand why interpretation is a problem, we need to understand that there is an alternative, and that alternative has to do with employing logic to understand the possibilities. So when we think about logic, we think about not about whether some thought is true, but the question of what follows from a thought. So this is what an argument does. If I present you an argument, I present a series of thoughts, which are called the premises. And if it's a good argument, it'll support the conclusion. Now, when we evaluate the logical merits of an argument, we're not asking whether what's said is true, because I can say a bunch of true things and it could be a bad argument because there could be no inferential support between the supposed premises and the conclusion, right? I could list your name, which would be true. I could list my name, which would be true, and then conclude, therefore, it's Friday, which also happens to be true as we're recording this. But there's no connection between your name, my name, and it being Friday. And yet I said a whole bunch of true things, right? So explaining things in terms of what you take to be true is seductive because it seems like you are understanding on the basis of the facts, but what you're really doing is you're giving up on the possibility to be reasonable. And alternatively, we can think about arguments where everything said is false, and yet the what's proposed actually does support the conclusion, right? So I think it's important to appreciate that there is such a thing as logic. We need it. It's different from just saying what you believe is true. And what's more important is that if you did explain things if you decided that you have to explain everything in terms of what you take to be true, you would be violating very basic considerations of logic, because logic is not about what you take to be true. So when people do this, when they decide that for them to understand, well, I mean, there's two kind of poisonous aspects. First, there's the individual thinking that for them to understand something, it has to be couched or explained in terms of what they already believe. But then there's there's the kind of the dangerous part that you've noted, where people present themselves as though they know something, and all they're doing is just telling you what they believe. So if that were a reasonable exercise, if us running around talking about what we believe were actually a reasonable thing to do, then there might be room for this phenomena that you were reporting, where every second yoga teacher is just telling you what they believe. But since this is a unreasonable thing to do, right, we really need to explicitly reject it. And the only way to do that is to work on the opposite set of skills. So one of the things I point out is that if you look at the beginning of the Yoga Sutra, it contrasts two different approaches to relating to your experiences. One is when you identify with them. So if I explain things in terms of what I believe, right, I'm identifying with those thoughts as what I think are the good explanations. And then the alternative is yoga's chitta vritti nirodha, where we take responsibility to influence and guide our thinking and our experiences. And that's exactly what we do when we are being reasonable. So it's this distinction between interpretation and explication. I don't have to bring yoga into the picture, but it was already appreciated by Patanjali in the Yoga Sutra as an absolutely important distinction. And yoga is only consistent with one. The other, which you note is widespread, is not yoga at all.
Mhm. So, I mean, there's just so much there that it's so powerful, and I really hope everybody listening kind of goes back and listens to this response, because it's you said so many things. I was trying to make notes as you were speaking, but I really want to pick on, how we're selling what we think as the truth, and that is so limited. And if I may say so, it's wrong, and it actually causes so much harm. And also rejecting and developing the opposite set of skills. That's so powerful, Shyam. I wanted to ask you, how do you define yoga?
Well, I'm as a scholar, I'm not trying to make something up. So I would just go back. I would say, well, in South Asia, right? Well, the word yoga can actually be used for all sorts of things, right? So like in astrology, planetary combinations are called yogas. And yoga usually means joining, but in philosophy, it only means one thing, and that's the philosophy of yoga. So sometimes people say, "Oh, yoga is used in all sorts of different ways," but when you ask the question, which is, well, what is it that this word is talking about in philosophical disagreement in South Asia? You will find that there is a core philosophy called yoga. We find that in the Yoga Sutra. And then there are other philosophies that aren't yoga, like, say, Buddhism or Jainism, that incorporate elements of yoga into their practices. And they call it explicitly yoga when they do it. So it wasn't like in the tradition people were really disagreeing about what yoga is. They were quite clear. It just meant that one philosophy. So that's my answer to the question of what yoga is. Well, let's look historically and see what people were talking about.
Is there the ultimate definition of yoga? Like for me, I've always said yoga chitta vritti nirodha, for me personally, is probably the definition of yoga. It's also, I think, comes down to how I've studied yoga. But do you have a particular definition that you think is, for lack of better word, the ultimate?
No, I mean, even in the Yoga Sutra, potentially gives you two different ways to think about yoga. He starts off book one with yoga's chitta vritti nirodha, but then when you go to book two, he begins with the account of yoga as a kriya, as a practice, and then gives you three practices of Ishvara Pranidhana, Tapas, and Swadhyaya, which is devotion to sovereignty, tapas challenging yourself, swadhyaya self-governance. So yoga is a thing that we could look at from different perspectives. And so depending upon the angle we take, we'll see something different. So if we're looking at it as a kind of completed state of perfection, then I think yoga's chitta vritti nirodha captures that. Yoga is the stilling or the respectful control or the influence of your mental life, and then it follows up, then the seer can abide in their essence, and then otherwise there is identification or influence by thought. So that's a way to capture yoga as like something done. But the interesting thing about yoga is that it's a practice, so there's also the other side to it. So I've always thought that they're just different ways of getting at the one thing. But definitely I would point to the Yoga Sutra as where we should be looking.
Okay. Okay. Now, when we refer to yoga philosophy, what does it encompass? I mean, you spoke a little bit about aspects of Jainism, Buddhism having practices of yoga, but if someone listening is trying to get started or explore yoga philosophy, what all does yoga philosophy encompass?
Great. So yoga shows up in the history. So there's a history to this, and it has to do with a dissatisfaction with an earlier phase in South Asian thought, where in the early Vedic period, people saw the universe as defined by natural forces that they called devas. And then they thought that in order to live a good life, they had to appease these forces
And
through
ritual.
sacrifice. Yeah, well, through sacrifice and giving the gods what they want, and then we would get what we want. Which they weren't foolish about this. Like, so for instance, when you look at the Vedas, there are these passages in the Brahmanas where they say things like, well, the fire of the sacrifice is the same as the fire in our body, right? And so that means that when I need to feed the fire of the sacrifice, I actually need to feed the metabolism of my body, right? So they had this appreciation of how nature places demands on us, and then we have, if we don't give in, we'll be in trouble. But the problem with that way of looking at things is that it makes life out to be something where we're always catching up and we're never in charge. So we can never really fix things for ourselves, right? We can never make things whole for ourselves. We're
And it's
always
also temporary, right? You have to keep doing it.
right. Well, yoga is also like that. You got to keep doing it. But the problem with that natural worldview is that you can't ever get rid of the problem. You're just putting it off. So at some point, some philosophers said, well, we need a different way of thinking about things. And this is where yoga shows up, where it's now the self instead of the outside world. It's the self that's the center of life. And a life that's well lived is one that's lived in accordance with the principles and traits of the self, which include things like growth and expansion and development. And the Vedic word for that is Brahman. Later on, as this started to develop, right, you started to see these parts of the Upanishads, the later part of the Vedas, where you have the philosophy of yoga articulated, like in the famous story in the Katha Upanishads, where Death talks to the young boy Nachiketa. And then later on, the most systematic formulation of this is in the Yoga Sutra. What the Yoga Sutra does is it takes the earlier and later, it takes the earlier and later parts of the Vedas, where on the earlier part you have this world where everything's explained by nature, and the latter where it's the self. And in the Yoga Sutra it says that, well, look, these are two different ways that we can explain life: by nature or by the self. And what we want to do is engage in a practice so that our lives are no longer explained by nature, but only by ourselves. And so the point of practice then is to actively change and engage in your life so that you are the explanation for what happens to you, not external events. So that ends up being a kind of central point. And already in the later Upanishads, where we find the story of Death talking to the young boy Nachiketa about the secrets of life and death, we get this core teaching of yoga there. But there too, it's the idea is that, well, when you practice yoga, you are in charge of your life, and then you determine that good things happen to you. Later on in the Bhagavad Gita, which comes later, you have a revisiting of all of these arguments again, right? And right, there's the famous war that's about to happen between the Pandavas and the Kauravas. And Arjuna, one of the Pandavas is despondent because he's got all sorts of reasons for why this sounds like a bad idea. And then Krishna delivers several arguments that are basically yoga arguments about how Arjuna that really we have two choices: that we can pretend like we're not responsible for what happens and then bad things will happen to us, or we engage in a practice that allows us to be the explanation of the success of our life. So that's the basic idea of yoga, right? It's about you being the center of the explanation of your life. But in order to get there, you have to be responsible for your life. It's not just a matter of kind of saying I'm the best or what I want should go. It's really about taking responsibility to transform your life so that you as a person have the space you need to live responsibly.
Mm-hmm. That's really powerful, just taking responsibility. And so that brings me to my next question. Is there an end goal of learning yoga philosophy? Or is this taking responsibility for your life and your actions the end goal? And a second question there would be, how does one measure if they're making progress? Or is it even measurable?
Yeah. So Yoga, to account for yoga as a practical theory, we have to go to the Yoga Sutra, where we learn that the core of yoga, the practice, is devotion to Ishvara, or sovereignty. So sovereignty is the ideal of right action. So when we're practicing yoga, we're doing everything as part of a devotion to this ideal. So I use an analogy, I use a musical analogy, right? So let's say you want to learn how to play an instrument. You have to first formulate the ideal of music and then decide to commit yourself to that ideal. And that in being committed or devoted to that ideal, you practice being musical and playing music. And at first, you won't be very good at it. But over time, as you are committed to this practice, your performance starts to change so that you start to exemplify the traits of the ideal that you're devoted to. But there's no end. It's not like when you get really good, you still can't improve more. That's because the Ishvara of the practice is always something you can aspire. It's aspirational. It's always something beyond you. So the difference between people who will never be all that good at music and the people who are remarkable is the people who are remarkable understand this about the ideal of the practice. It's always aspirational. You never come to the point where you go, "Oh, I've made it." Right? There's always this sense of there's more room for self transformation. Now, in the case of yoga or life, Ishvara is the ideal of the practice of being a person. And so there's no point at which we have there's no point at which we couldn't say to ourselves there's more that we could do. The Yoga Sutra does say that at a point where you get over your selfishness in every context you're in, and the Dharma Mega Samadhi, this moral cleansing, then you enter into a state where nature is no longer a factor of your life, even though it's a factor in other people's lives. So there is that kind of theoretical end where you're able to function in every context in terms of your interest to be responsible and not in terms of selfish concerns of the moment. So that's a kind of theoretical possibility. But when I think about the core idea of devotion to sovereignty, right, there's kind of no end to that. But what I would say, this kind of to close this, is that in yoga, the primary concern is about the right choice, the right activity. And the good is just a perfection of that practice. So as you get better at the practice, there's more of a sense of accomplishment, but there's no end to it. So that's what I would say about yoga. But you also asked about philosophy. So yoga philosophy is simply yoga. And another thing that I've learned is that in order to actually learn philosophy, you have to engage in yoga. It's the same thing. That is, you can't learn philosophy by trying to understand things in terms of your experiences or beliefs. You have to take responsibility for yourself as a thinker. And then when you're doing that, you're doing yoga.
There's this is probably not directly related to what you were talking about, but one thing that really appeals to me when for yoga philosophy is it's just there's no guilt in the context of yoga. Like there's if you had a bad day and you couldn't practice what you wanted to practice, then tomorrow is a fresh start. And there's no baggage we carry from day to day, and every day it's like a new slate. For me, that's really powerful. It's not related to anything you said, but just the fact that there's
Yeah,
no
yeah.
guilt or ego attached to it, and how we mitigate that ego constantly is an extremely cherished part of the practice for me. Because a lot of people will be like, oh, but yesterday this happened. I'm like, that's in the past. Just if you're really practicing, it's about this present moment. So just really powerful. I want to ask you here if if a yoga teacher, and when I say yoga teacher, I'm actually talking mostly about an asana teacher who was introduced to modern yoga in a yoga studio, and they want to start their journey, philosophy journey in this context. What's the first text they start with, or what's the starting point? Would you say the Yoga Sutras are the starting point, or is there something else?
Well, I think the real starting point is learning about philosophy. I think one of the problems that we have, and this has to do with interpretation, is that because we live in this westernized context where people aren't clear about what it is to be a responsible thinker. They think that mistakenly learning yoga philosophy is about learning the beliefs of the yogi. And so then they'll want a book that they can study, and then that will teach them what to believe. So the Yoga Sutra is useless to you if that's the way you go about it, right? It's and
So
so
true.
and 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 one of the reasons why I decided I needed to translate the Yoga Sutra is that every translation I touched was a translation that just sounded like whatever that person already believed, kind of thrown at the Yoga Sutra. So you can go out and buy these books, and then you can think, oh, I'm learning the Yoga Sutra, but you're really just learning what the translator believes, right? So there's an extra step, there's an extra missing step in this, which is a commitment to philosophy. So one of the things that I point out is that if you want to understand what's really bizarre about the Western tradition is that it's never really liked philosophy, right? So it begins with the murder of Socrates, and Socrates is murdered for he's brought up on the charges of corrupting the youth and promoting false gods. That could never have happened in ancient South Asia because everybody had their own view about what gods to worship and how to raise your kids. Like everybody thought that, well, that's just what we disagree about, right? And if you went back to ancient South Asia, you would see that people were openly philosophically disagreeing with each other on everything. In the Western tradition, because you have this model of thought that says that thought is the meaning of what we say, and then that undermines the possibilities of people being reasonable, but it's also tied to language. So there's this sense of shared beliefs that we have to buy in order to be understood. It creates a hostile environment for the study of philosophy. So when I look at the contemporary context where people say, "Oh, I'm studying yoga philosophy," or "I want to learn about yoga philosophy," and then they just they go listen to someone preach to them about what the Yoga Sutra says or something. That's just a continuity of the Western tradition. If you really want to unpack what's going on, there has to be a broader commitment to philosophy as its own yoga, its own practice. And then within that context, you could, if you have a teacher who's sensitive to these things, unfortunately there are virtually none, but that's the way I would go. So let's say, people listening to this, they can contact me, but let's say you didn't know about me and you couldn't there was no way to learn from me. The message I would hope people would get in touch with, the idea is that there's no way to understand yoga, the philosophy, without understanding what it is to think philosophically. So that would be my first step.
That's really good. That's great advice. I I love the fact that you said, you've got to you have to learn how to be a responsible thinker. And I've often said this to some of the people who've asked me questions about, where do we study yoga, that more than where do you study yoga, it's more about you have to see who are you studying from and who were there, do your research. Don't just blindly sign up for something because, which you just found it and it's convenient.
Yeah, sure, yes.
And I think just in modern yoga, not necessarily the work you do, but more the work I do, like being an asana teacher. It's just who you learn from can actually, that's how you set yourself up for life in yoga. And it's just so overlooked. So I'm glad you bring that up. And would you say it's extremely important to find teachers of South Asian descent, or people who have studied Sanskrit extensively? Do you think that's really important in when we're approaching yoga philosophy?
Yeah, so my view will be unpopular, but I think neither are important for the following reason. That I think that the focus on ethnicity and language is actually a manifestation of Western imperialism. Because if you go back to ancient South Asian philosophy and yoga philosophy, no one said you need to find someone who knows Sanskrit to study from, or it has to be someone like those ideas were just so foreign to what they were talking about. In fact, most of the arguments by philosophers who were interested in yoga meditation were very critical of conventional society and conventional ways of going about things. And so there's something kind of counterculture about yoga and yoga philosophy and the way it was practiced and developed in ancient South Asia. Post-Western imperialism, because you have this tradition that takes over the world that says that, well, thought is about language, then you have this mind-boggling emphasis on the study of Sanskrit. So it's even worse amongst European scholars. So one of the things that I comment on is that the study of South Asian philosophy or Indian philosophy has been taken over by amateurs who aren't trained in philosophy. They're just linguists or philologists. That's a whole other discipline. So, that would be like trying to learn how to be a physicist from an English lit major. Like you just can't do that, right? But yet, given the Western tradition and its confusion of thought and language, in a westernized world, people think, oh, I need to find someone who really knows the language. My point is that you really need to find someone who treats this as real philosophy. Now, unfortunately, given the political context we're in, it's very difficult. I mean, I have to say that, like, for instance, even to get to the point where we're in a position to start learning about these things, you'd have to be clear about the distinction between interpretation and explication. I was the first one to write about this in print, which surprises me. So we're really, I mean, so the one advantage is that because we're global now, it's possible to learn from people who know what they're taught, who are actual experts in what it is that they are teaching anywhere in the world. The unfortunate part is that because of the history of Western imperialism, both in the academy and in the yoga world, we get this westernized notion of yoga education as this anthropological or linguistic thing. So I would say philosophy. And one of the things that I like to point out is that if you are really kind of critical of Western imperialism, there's no better way to be kind of anti-Western than study philosophy. Because as mentioned, the Western tradition was never really fond of philosophy to begin with.
Mhm. So there's something I want to ask you here about. In this may not, it's not a great question in my head, but I'm going to ask you anyway. How much time does it take to learn even a little bit of philosophy? Would you say, I'm thinking in my head, it's like a lifetime. But I want to point out that yoga teachers are on this strange, asana teachers, strange fast track, and they want everything quickly and in a matter of 10 hours, 30 hours. Yeah.
So it's not so learning a little bit does not take a lifetime, but it takes time. So one of the things that you first of all need to learn from someone who knows what they're teaching. And then you need to structure the learning in the following way. You have to read the text, listen to any lectures that are provided, and then give yourself time to think. And then go do other things. Just go do the laundry, do life, and then come back to it after a week. And for some reason, everything will become clearer in your brain. Your brain is actually processing these things. So it not only takes specific focus to read, to learn what someone's teaching, you also need to give your body a break and an opportunity to process it, and then you come back to it. Now that's just for one lesson, right? And so, something like the Yoga Sutra, you could spend, so for instance, I have a 2-month course just on book 2 of the Yoga Sutra, right? And the idea is that, well, you take 2 months to explore the material. So it's not impossible, but you're absolutely right that there is this schedule that people have. And I think that schedule doesn't work for anything that's transformative, right? Like you can't become a ripped gym rat on an 8-week schedule. Like, there's that, like, if you want to be strong, you have to give yourself rest, you have to give yourself a workout, you have to pace it, you have to spread it out over time. So same principles apply to the study of philosophy.
I'm glad you addressed that, because the mindset with how we approach this and work through it is so important. Can I take a leap here with you? Because I know you've written 4 books, is that correct at this point? Or more?
Well, two are monographs. One is a translation, and I have two edited volumes.
Oh, wow. Okay. So I want to talk to you about Hinduism. Okay. And because this is a question that has been floating around in the yoga world for a very long time. And I don't want to ask it to just anybody.
Okay, thank
And
you.
I think you'd be, somebody who would really be able to bring us clarity on this. One is, what is Hinduism and how is it related to yoga, or how is yoga related to Hinduism?
Okay, great. So, first, a historical lesson about Hinduism. Like the word Hindu is not even Indian, it's Persian. And it was used by the Persians to talk about Sindhu, which is in the northwest of India. And then it got broadened to be a word to talk about South Asia. When the British came to power, they decided that they needed a word to talk about all South Asian religion that was not Islam. And that's what Hindu was used. Hindu was pressed in that service. So Hinduism became an official religion by virtue of some bureaucratic decision by the British. Now, not only did Hinduism become a religion, but so did, say, Sikhism and Jainism and Buddhism. That is, the idea of religion is foreign to South Asia. Now, where does this idea of religion come from at all? It has everything to do with the Western tradition. At a very early stage, the Romans actually had this word religio, where they used it for acceptable ancient cultural traditions. And then what ended up happening is that it got transferred its application changed to talk about traditions that have roots outside of Europe. So, right, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, those are religion because they have roots outside of Europe. And what could have been European religion ends up being relegated to like literature, like Homer, right? And then as Westerners pushed out in colonial expansion, everywhere they went, they would use this idea of religion to talk about non Western traditions. Now, the reason this happened was because of interpretation, right? So if you think that to be reasonable is to say the kinds of things that we say, as Europeans did because of their linguistic account of thought, then everybody from outside of their tradition will seem mysterious and as though they're just acting on faith, not reason. It's just some type of settled practice that's beyond philosophy, right? Now, one of the things that's so when you look at it on a global scale, it's obvious the only things that ever get called a world religion are traditions that have non-European roots. The other thing that becomes obvious is that the same position said by a European, like say Plato, is counted as secular philosophy. Like Plato, for instance, argues for the existence of God in an afterlife. No one calls that religion. But if something like that is affirmed because of your intellectual tradition coming from outside of Europe, religion. South Asia, it's actually very difficult to find a proper theistic position. And so one of the things that I note is interesting about Hinduism is that even though it becomes a religion in exactly the same way that everything becomes a religion, namely that it just can't be interpreted by the Western tradition, the word Hindu, what it was used to label, is the entire South Asian tradition. Now, it did happen at the time that some people decided that they wanted their tradition to have its own religious designation. So so that happened there too, but that doesn't contradict the fact that when the word Hindu was used to talk about a religion, it was meant to talk about everything. So one of the things that I point out in my book Hinduism, a contemporary philosophical investigation, is that Hindu, if we're really going to be historical and accurate, is just a way to talk about the disagreements of philosophy in South Asia. That is, every possible position that you could imagine falls within the category of Hinduism. There's no basic commitment that all Hindus share historically. Now, post colonially, so how does yoga fit into all this? Well, yoga is a South Asian position, it's an ancient South Asian position, so it would be taken up by the category of Hinduism. One of the things that I point out is that Hinduism is a class category, which is like fruit salad. Fruit salad is a class category. So so the definition of fruit salad is something like a collection of different pieces of fruit. It doesn't follow from that if you take a piece of fruit salad, like say a piece of apple, that it's a collection of different pieces of fruit, right? It's just an apple. But you put it back in with the mixture, fruit salad. So I say Hinduism is exactly like this. It's a label for the entire South Asian tradition. So but if you take out individual positions and look at them on their own, you won't see anything called Hinduism because, in fact, South Asians isn't even that isn't even a South Asian word. But you put it back in together with all the options, Hinduism. So we need so post-colonially, of course, people because they start being raised in a world conditioned by Western imperialism, they start confabulating. So there's a push to make up a story about what all Hindus believe, etc. But that's more about how people want to self-represent today. That isn't a historical or accurate account of all the things that are Hindu historically.
It's remind me, I was born and raised in India. I don't know if I told you that I moved to Seattle about 8 years ago. And it just occurred to me that when I think of the question, like, is yoga religious? It's something that's been asked to me only honestly after I moved here.
Right.
I've never occurred to me that nobody in India was asking me, while doing yoga, is it religious? Just, yeah, a side thought, just as you were talking.
That's great. Well, I look at my parents' tradition as over millennia old, and when they're seriously involved in the tradition, no one talks about themselves as a Hindu, and they don't use the word religion either, right? They're engaged in their practice, and it's a devotional practice, and there are all these yogic elements to it, and they never need to call upon these concepts, right? Absolutely, it's when you start having conversations with the with the outside, so to speak. But that's exactly what religion is. It's this idea that there's an inside, which is the Western tradition, and then there's this outside, which is religion. And then we're trying to figure out what it is that those religious people are up to. Meanwhile, we're just not listening to what they have to say, right? Which is their philosophy.
And it's also this certain obsession with labels that we want to give ourselves and we want to give to others, and somehow we're intolerant of each other's labels while we're so obsessed with it. Shyam, I can talk to you, honestly, I have so many more questions in my mind, but this has been amazing. And I really hope that the listeners actually, take this podcast episode apart and listen to all the stuff that's really packed in this. Where can people find you and how can they study with you?
Oh, thank you for asking. So my website is yogaphilosophy.com. So yoga philosophy, all one word.com. So that's one place you can find me. I'm also on Instagram. I do a lot of posting on yoga philosophy there, and it's yogaphilosophy_com. So if you're not on Instagram, I mean, even if you're not, either way, you can go to the website, yogaphilosophy.com, and then you can find links to free content and my social media and my courses and books, etc.
Thank you so much, Shyam. I'll make sure to link everything in our show notes.
Thank you so much. This has been lovely.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. As always, you can find the links to everything at letstalk.yoga. Please remember to rate, review, and subscribe to the Let's Talk Yoga podcast. Before you go, I wanted to address a mistake I made in one of my previous episodes. A couple of weeks ago, we had Adeline Xiong talking about restorative yoga. I believe in the intro, I said Adeline instead of Adeline Xiong. Just wanted to correct that and put that on record here. Okay. Take care. Enjoy your week ahead, and I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.